Including Egypt, Lower Nubia displayed all the hallmarks of an incipient civilization. Yet it was not to be. The written and archaeological evidence tell the same story, one of Egyptian conquest and subjugation. Egypt's early rulers, in their determination to acquire control of trade routes and to eliminate all opposition, moved swiftly to snuff out their Nubian rivals before they could pose a real threat. The inscription at Gabel Sheikh Suleiman, discussed in the previous chapter, which shows a giant scorpion holding in its pincers a defeated Nubian chieftain, is a graphic illustration of Egyptian policy toward Nubia. A second inscription nearby, dating to the threshold of the First Dynasty, completes the story. It shows a scene of devastation, with Nubians lying dead and dying, watched over by the cipher hieroglyphic marker of the Egyptian king. The prosperous city-states of the Near East, which were useful trading partners and geographically separate from Egypt, could be allowed to exist, but a rival kingdom immediately upstream was unthinkable. Following Egypt's decisive early intervention in Lower Nubia, this stretch of the Nile Valley, though it would remain a thorn in Egypt's side, would not rise again as a serious power for nearly 1,000 years. Taxation without representation. Secure in its borders, with hegemony over the Nile Valley and flourishing trade links, the early Egyptian state witnessed a marked rise in overall prosperity, but the rewards were not evenly spread across the population. Cemeteries that span the period of state formation show a sudden polarization of grave size and wealth, a widening gap between rich and poor, with those who were already affluent benefiting the most. The greatest beneficiary by far was the state itself, for the practical effect of political unification was to convey all land into royal ownership, while individuals and communities continued to farm their land as they had before. They now found themselves with a landlord who expected rent in return for their use of his property. The First Dynasty government lost no time in devising and imposing a nationwide system of taxation to turn the country's agricultural productivity to its own advantage. Once again, writing played a key role. From the very beginning of recorded history, the Egyptian government used written records to keep accounts of the nation's wealth and to levy taxes. Some of the very earliest ink inscriptions, on pottery jars from the time of Narmer, refer to revenue received from Upper and Lower Egypt. It seems that, for greatest efficiency, the country was already divided into two halves. For the purposes of taxation, the government's ambition to control every aspect of the national economy is underlined by two measures introduced in the First Dynasty. Both are attested on the Palermo stone, a fragment of royal annals that were compiled in the Fifth Dynasty, around 2400, and stretched back to the beginning of recorded history. The earliest surviving entry, for a First Dynasty king, probably Narmer's immediate successor, concerns an event called the Following of Horus, which evidently took place every 2 years. Most probably, it consisted of a journey by the king and his court along the Nile Valley. In common with the royal progresses of Tudor England, it would have served several purposes at once. It allowed the monarch to be a visible presence in the life of his subjects, enabled his officials to keep a close eye on everything that was happening in the country at large, implementing policies, resolving disputes, and dispensing justice, defrayed the costs of maintaining the court, and removed the burden of supporting it year-round in one location, and, last but by no means least, facilitated the systematic assessment and levying of taxes. A little later, in the Second Dynasty, the court explicitly recognized the actuarial potential of the Following of Horus. Thereafter, the event was combined with a formal census of the country's agricultural wealth. From the third reign of the First Dynasty, the Palermo stone also records the height of the annual Nile inundation, measured in cubits. In fractions of a cubit, one ancient Egyptian cubit equals 20.6 inches. The reason why the court would have wished to measure and archive this information every year is simple. The height of the inundation directly affected the level of agricultural yield the following season, and would therefore have allowed the royal treasury to determine the appropriate level of taxation when it came to collecting taxes in the form of a proportion of farm produce. We must assume a network of officials operated on behalf of the state throughout Egypt. There can be no doubt that their efforts were backed up by coercive measures. The inscriptions left by some of these government officials, mostly in the form of seal impressions, allow us to recreate the workings of the treasury, which was by far the most important department from the very beginning of Egyptian history. Agricultural produce collected as government revenue was treated in one of two ways. A certain proportion went directly to state workshops for the manufacture of secondary products, for example, tallow and leather from cattle, pork from pigs, linen from flax, bread, beer, and basketry from grain. Some of these value-added products were then traded and exchanged at a profit, producing further government income. Others were redistributed as payment to state employees, thereby funding the court and its projects. The remaining portion of agricultural produce, mostly grain, was put into storage in government granaries, probably located throughout Egypt in important regional centers. Some of the stored grain was used in its raw state to finance court activities, but a significant share was put aside as emergency stock, to be used in the event of a poor harvest to help prevent widespread famine. Whether this represented genuine altruism or practical self-interest on the part of the state depends on one's point of view. The people as a whole certainly benefited from this national insurance policy, but at a cost to themselves. This, of course, is the enduring truth about taxes. With a national system in place for assessing, collecting, and redistributing taxes, Egypt's early kings could turn their attention to increasing productivity, both in agriculture and in the machinery of government. Administrations developed their own momentum, bureaucracies their own priorities, and while the Egyptian populace may have benefited indirectly from enhancements to the nation's political and economic infrastructure, it is difficult not to see the enhancements as essentially self-serving on the part of the ruling elite. In ancient Egypt, an increase in national prosperity facilitated the construction of yet more sumptuous monuments celebrating the king, not the provision of facilities for the masses or the amelioration of their living conditions. The government's focus on the elite is especially apparent under King Den, whose reign in the middle of the First Dynasty, circa 2850, marks an important milestone in the rise of ancient Egypt. In his 3 or 4 decades on the throne, innovations were introduced in many different spheres, from the royal titulary to the design of the royal tomb. The introduction of an entrance stairway, to facilitate access to the burial chamber, seems obvious in retrospect, but the stairway revolutionized the provisioning of the tomb and paved the way for much larger funerary monuments in due course. Changes were also afoot beyond the narrow confines of the court. An entry on the Palermo stone records the reorganization of agricultural lands in the delta, possibly involving the relocation of entire communities to allow for the establishment of royal estates. The government, it seems, was not a particularly benevolent landlord. The redesignation of whole tracts of Lower Egypt as crown land was the precursor to wider administrative reforms. To allow for more effective political control of the regions, the state introduced a system of local government that divided the Nile Valley and Delta into 42 provinces, nomes, each governed by a centrally appointed official, the nomarch, answerable to the king. The Upper Egyptian provinces seem to have been based upon traditional community boundaries, themselves reflecting the irrigation basins of prehistoric times. In the Delta, by contrast, there was no such template, and here the newly created provinces seem to have been more arbitrary, no doubt. working around the location of royal estates. Either way, replacing an earlier system of allegiance with a new, systematic pattern of provincial administration gave the king and his government much tighter control. Governmental reforms continued during the latter half of the first dynasty. A rise in the number of high officials who were granted a lavish burial, paid for by the state, indicates an expansion and professionalization of the administration. At North Saqqara, the main court cemetery serving Memphis, the highest functionaries in the land built huge mud brick tombs, known by the Arabic term mastaba, along the edge of the escarpment, facing the sunrise and overlooking the capital city. These imposing monuments promised their occupants both rebirth and a continuation of their earthly status. The facades of the tombs, modeled on white wall at Memphis, provided a visual demonstration of their owners' royal connections. For the king was the ultimate fount of authority, and most, if not all, high officials at this period were royal relatives. One such tomb was built at North Saqqara for a man named Hamaka, who served under King Den as chancellor, at the head of the treasury. Among his grave goods was a small inlaid wooden box containing 2 rolls of papyrus, the earliest examples yet discovered. There could be no better illustration of the close connection between writing and power in early Egypt. Indeed, the earliest autobiographical inscription from the Nile Valley is written on the gravestone of one of Hamaka's successors. Merka served under the last king of the first dynasty, and his particular combination of titles and appointments reveals the nature of high office in early Egypt. Despite holding a number of positions connected with the royal household, including director of the royal bark, the king's state boat, and controller of the audience chamber, Merka gained his exceptional status from an ancient religious office associated with the cult of divine kingship. For him and his contemporaries, the king was the only route to career advancement. Merka's motley collection of administrative, courtly, and religious titles reflects an administrative system that was, on the whole, rather loosely organized. Except perhaps in the treasury, there was no precise demarcation of responsibilities. Proximity to the king was all that mattered. The tombs constructed at North Saqqara for Hamaka, Merka, and other high officials were not just rewards for loyal service, however. They also served as a bold and highly visible statement of the government's authority, silhouetted against the skyline. At sites found along the length and breadth of the Nile Valley, from Giza and Tarkan, in the north to Inerti, modern Gebline, and Iuni, modern Armant, in the south, the unification of the country and the resulting royal omnipotence were announced in the same way. The sudden appearance of imposing tombs in the palace facade style, dominating their local communities, must have had a profound effect on the population at large. The impact must have been comparable to that felt after the construction of motte and bailey castles throughout England after the Norman conquest, and the message was the same: the whole country was now ruled by the king and his appointees. The tentacles of government reached into every province. A new order had arrived. A final, telling example of how the early Egyptian state imposed its control can be found at the country's southern frontier, on the island of Abu. Here, at the very beginning of the first dynasty, the government lost no time in building a massive fortified customs post to monitor and regulate the movement of people and goods across the border with Nubia. The fact that the chosen location for the fortress, an elevated part of the island, overlooking the main channel for shipping, also cut off access to the local shrine, was evidently of no concern to national authorities. Economic and political control were far more important considerations than local sensibilities. From the dawn of history, the state's arrogance and its dealings with the population set the scene for the next 3,000 years. For the ancient Egyptians, the price of national unity, effective government, and a successful economy was authoritarian rule. New directions. The death of Ka, last king of the first dynasty, around 2750, was marked with the usual obsequies in the ancestral royal burial ground at Abju. The king's funeral cortege made its way slowly from his palace of Eternity, a huge mud brick enclosure near the town, to his remote burial place among the tombs of his forebears. The chosen spot was aligned with a prominent cleft in the cliffs, which the Egyptians believed to be an entrance to the underworld. The king's body was placed in his burial chamber, accompanied by a host of supplies to sustain his spirit in the afterlife, so that his unfortunate attendants could cater for his every need. Their bodies were interred around him in subsidiary graves. Then, the chamber was sealed, the process watched over by Ka's heir, the new king, Hatshepsut. A smooth transition of power had been effected, a new reign had begun. There was little to suggest that Hatshepsut would inaugurate a very different era of Egyptian history, yet later chroniclers identified him as the first king of a new dynasty. The reason lies in his dramatic decision to abandon Abju, where kings had been buried for more than 3 centuries, and found an entirely new royal burial ground hundreds of miles to the north. The site he chose was Saqqara, overlooking the capital city of Memphis. The reasons behind the move to Saqqara are obscure. Perhaps Hatshepsut had family ties to the region, or perhaps he calculated that a monument as symbolically charged as the king's tomb should stand at the very balance of the two lands, not in an Upper Egyptian province. Whatever the motive, the radical location of his tomb was matched by its design. It was aligned to true north, rather than to the local geography. It was cut into the rock rather than built of mud brick. It was arranged as a series of long galleries opening off a central corridor, rather than as a burial chamber surrounded by storerooms. And it terminated in a suite of rooms resembling the private quarters of a contemporary house. Hatshepsut was concerned that his spirit should be provided with every necessity for the hereafter, not just food and drink, but all modern conveniences, including a bedroom and bathroom. His 2 successors, Kings Nibra and Niger, maintained his innovations and built their tombs at Saqqara, but the second dynasty's outward stability masked rising tensions in the country at large. In the middle of Niger's reign, circa 2700, civil unrest seems to have broken out. An obscure entry on the Palermo stone speaks of hacking up Shem Ra in the north. If Lower Egypt was trying to secede from central control, it might explain why the 2 or 3 kings after Niger are unknown in the south of the country. Perhaps the first dynasty's focus on Upper Egypt had led to simmering resentment among Egypt's northern population. The latter half of the second dynasty provides further tantalizing clues that hint at a political breach. 3 or 4 generations after it had been abandoned, Abju was promptly reinstated as the royal burial ground. The decision was taken by a king who, unique in the history of ancient Egypt, cast himself as the earthly incarnation not of Horus, celestial god and patron deity of kingship, but of Seth, god of the deserts, and local god of Nut. The reasons for such a radical move can only be guessed at. The Upper Egyptian focus on the Seth cult may have appealed to a king whose authority seems to have been greatest in the south of the country. Yet, despite his unprecedented titulary, the Seth king, Pharaoh, circa 2680, seems to have taken great pains to adopt the other trappings of traditional Egyptian monarchy. His tomb at Abju was consciously modeled on its first dynasty precursors, deliberately harking back to the early years of the pharaonic state. Pharaoh was also the first king since Ka to build a separate funerary palace at Abju. All in all, the written and architectural evidence from the middle of the Second Dynasty suggests a period of turmoil. The hard-won unity of the early Egyptian monarchy was weakened and undermined, and the institution of kingship itself was under greater stress than at any time since the Wars of Unification. What the state needed was another strong leader in the mold of Narmer, someone with the charisma, strength, and determination to rebuild the edifice of power before all was lost. Step forward. Kasekim. Ancient Egyptian civilization may never have progressed beyond its formative stage, may never have developed its distinctive pyramids, temples, and tombs, had it not been for the last ruler of the second dynasty, circa 2670. Kasekim's very name, the power has appeared, announced his intentions, and he lived up to them. He is a pivotal figure in ancient Egyptian history, bridging the transition between an older culture, essentially derived from prehistoric forms, and a new, quintessentially pharaonic civilization with a bolder vision. Like Karabson, Kasekim seems to have come from Upper Egypt, and his power base, too, was in the south. He lavished particular attention on Nekhen, dedicating statues and stone vessels in its cult center and starting work on a massive enclosure behind the town. His so-called fort is the oldest standing mud brick structure in the world, its walls still towering 34 feet high, more than 4,500 years after they were built. Kasekim's intention to reign as a traditional king was likewise signaled by his restoration of the traditional royal titulary, announcing himself as the incarnation of the sky god Horus. It was crucial for Egypt's destiny that these outward displays of authority were matched by Kasekim's resolve to reunify the country and bring the whole of the two lands under his sway. Two life-size statues of the king from Nekhen show him wearing the tight-fitting robe of the royal jubilee, one of the most ancient celebrations of kingship. Their bases are inscribed not with the king's titles but with scenes of war dead in contorted positions. The accompanying hieroglyphs read, 47,209 northern enemies. Kasekim's stone vessels from the same shrine are also carved with scenes of triumph. The upper Egyptian vulture goddess, Nekbet, stands on a ring containing the word rebel, while an inscription reads the year of fighting the northern enemy. These ancient documents seem to record the launch of an offensive by Kasekim's forces. His intention was to reconquer rebellious Lower Egypt and forcibly re-annex it to the crown. It was a bold vision, but under Kasekim's leadership it was swiftly realized. The king marked his successful reunification of Egypt by subtly changing his name and titles. Kasekim became Kasekimli. The two powers have appeared, supplemented by the epithet the two lords are at peace in him. The Horus falcon was joined by the Seth animal atop the royal cipher. Conflict had been resolved, harmony restored, and opposing forces reconciled in the person of the king. Once again, national unity ushered in a period of economic activity and cultural renaissance. And once again, the basis was tight: central control of the country's resources. The Palermo stone records the reinstatement of a regular census, only this time it was a census of golden fields, encompassing both the mineral and agricultural wealth of Egypt. With the government coffers full again, Egypt re-established trading contacts with the Near East. Its particular interest was no longer southern Palestine, as in the past, but the port of Kabul, classical Byblos, modern Jubail, north of Beirut. The king even presented a local temple with an inscribed stone vessel, to cement the bond of friendship. Further apart, the traders of Kabul supplied Egypt with two of the most important raw materials it coveted, cedar and tin. Cedar logs were essential for shipbuilding, since Egypt lacked its own supply of good quality timber, and large seagoing ships were an imperative for trade contacts with the rest of the eastern Mediterranean. An entry on the Palermo stone for the 17th year of Kasekimli's reign, circa 2655, refers to shipbuilding, and the results of the tin trade are evident in his burial at Abju, Ayur, and basin from the royal tomb are the earliest bronze vessels from the Nile Valley. The superior technology of bronze, together with an increase in trade income, facilitated an upsurge in state construction projects, and Khosakemwy was by far the most prolific builder in Egypt's early history. He dedicated new temple buildings throughout Upper Egypt, and completed his cult enclosure at Nekhen before turning his attention to Abju. Following in the footsteps of his immediate predecessor, he chose the ancient burial ground of kings for his own funerary monuments. His enclosure at Abju dwarfed even its counterpart at Nekhen, and dominates the surrounding area to this day. As for the royal tomb, the king's architects chose an entirely new design, combining elements from First Dynasty and early Second Dynasty traditions. It was as if he were announcing that all the developments of Egyptian civilization up to that point were being brought together under his leadership, and he was looking to the future, too. His burial chamber was lined with carefully dressed blocks of limestone, on a scale that had never been attempted before. It was a taste of things to come. It used to be thought that Khosakemwy confined his building projects to Upper Egypt, but recent survey and excavation suggest that he decided to make his mark in the north as well, far out in the desert. At Saqqara, beyond the modern tourist trail, beyond even the reach of the camel drivers, lie the remains of a truly vast enclosure. It is most easily visible in aerial photographs. On the ground its walls are discernible only as a low ridge. The dimensions are staggering. It measures 1/4 mile wide by nearly half a mile long. No wonder its local Arabic name is Gizr el-Mutter, the enclosure of the boss. Partial excavation of the walls shows that they were built of huge stone blocks laid in sloping courses, while the corners are of solid masonry construction. No inscriptions have yet been found to confirm the date of the Gizr el-Mutter, but it looks increasingly likely that it was built by Khosakemwy, a third monumental enclosure of his reign. In its finished state, it would have been by far the biggest and most impressive royal monument Egypt had ever seen. Khosakemwy had brought the country to the threshold of a new age. Pyramids and politics. Today, the Gizr el-Mutter is but a shadow of its former self. The reason is not that it was left unfinished, nor that it was poorly built. The explanation lies within view, on the skyline of Saqqara, the step pyramid of King Nechereket. The builders of Egypt's first pyramid did what their successors would do throughout Egyptian history. They looked around for a ready source of building stone and found it in a nearby monument. Rather than going to the trouble of quarrying new stone, they simply dismantled the Gizr el-Mutter and reused its blocks to build something even grander. The result, the step pyramid, dominates our view of the Third Dynasty, 2650 to 2575, just as it dominates the landscape. The ruler for whom it was built was Khosakemwy's immediate heir and chosen successor. But if Nechereket inherited his father's predilection for grand designs, he was equally determined to eclipse Khosakemwy's achievements. He would take the visible expression of absolute power to new heights, literally as well as metaphorically. The step pyramid started life ambitiously enough, as a huge, massive tomb, built in stone to last for eternity. It rose in one single step, towering above the king's burial chamber, a mountain of stone to replicate the primeval mound of creation. In a brilliant flash of inspiration, the two elements of the earlier royal burials at Abju, a tomb and a separate funerary enclosure, were combined into a single monument by constructing a huge wall round the mastaba. From the outside, it resembled White Wall at nearby Memphis and thus announced its royal associations. The space inside the enclosure was filled with a collection of dummy buildings, for this was the grandest of all stage sets, designed as an eternal backdrop for the ceremonies of kingship. For the first time in history, the brilliant conception and execution of a royal monument can be attributed to a known individual. His name echoes down the centuries as the epitome of ancient Egyptian wisdom and learning, Hotep. A statue based from the entrance colonnade of the step pyramid, where it could be seen by all those entering the enclosure, bears his name together with that of his king. Although Hotep bore a string of titles: royal seal bearer, first under the king, ruler of the great estate, member of the elite, greatest of seers, and overseer of sculptors and painters, he is nowhere explicitly named as the architect of the step pyramid. Yet it was as the pyramid's architect that he achieved posthumous fame, and he is the only plausible candidate. Nobody else held such a prominent position at the court of King Necherikhet. Nobody else was immortalized within the step pyramid complex itself. Hotep's extraordinary vision saw the development of the royal tomb from a single-step mastaba to a four-step pyramid and finally to a six-step form, the tallest building of its time. The idea for the step shape may already have been latent within Egyptian ideology, but the translation of this idea into stone, on a monumental scale, was Imhotep's lifetime achievement. His innovation marks the beginning of the Pyramid Age, and it had far-reaching effects. The administrative effort required for pyramid building was greater than anything Egypt had developed to date. A step change in government organization was needed, and one of the first moves was the creation of the post of vizier, a single individual in overall charge of the government machine, reporting directly to the king. The vizier was hence Egypt's chief minister, with the added power that came from direct access to the monarch. Necherikhet's inner circle of trusted lieutenants, who are better known than any of their predecessors, likewise exemplify the increasing professionalism of the court. Inc. and Sepa were district administrators. Inkwell was the controller of the royal bark. Hazira was master of the royal scribes, perhaps the leading civil servant, and Kabosokar was the controller of the royal workshops. The old system of royal relatives holding a portfolio of unrelated offices was being replaced by a more structured bureaucracy, opened up, for the first time, to career professionals, drawn from a wider section of society and promoted on merit. As Egypt embarked on pyramid building, the pyramids were building Egypt. This quiet revolution in government is particularly well illustrated by the career of Mechen. His tomb inscription from Saqqara includes the earliest extensive autobiographical text, and it charts his rise from humble storehouse clerk to a position in local government, followed by promotion to the governorship of several Delta provinces. At the end of his career, as a trusted courtier, Mechen was appointed controller of the king's pleasure palace in the Fayum. It was a pattern of advancement that would be followed for many centuries to come. From now on, the history of ancient Egypt would be made by private individuals as well as their royal masters. The reign of Necherikhet, 2650 to 2620, and the achievements of his court were so impressive that his successors in the Third Dynasty pale into insignificance by comparison. Most are little more than obscure names in the historical record: Sekhemkhet, Kaba, and Sanikht. None left a monument even approaching the step pyramid in scale, although several tried. Only when we reach the end of the Third Dynasty and the reign of King Huni, 2600 to 2575, do the advances of the Pyramid Age manifest themselves. Yet, unless a ruined pyramid at Meidum has been misattributed, Huni did not indulge in pyramid building on a lavish scale. His greatest contribution to the future glories of pharaonic civilization was far more prosaic, but no less significant. Its architectural manifestation, not one gigantic pyramid but a series of small ones, scattered throughout the provinces of Egypt. From those monuments discovered so far, a clear building program emerges. The southernmost pyramid was constructed on the island of Abu, always a favored location for statements of royal power. This monument and its associated palace were named the Diadem of Huni. Moving downstream, the king commissioned another pyramid at Giba, modern Edfu, a third at El Kula, near Nekhen, a fourth at Tuk, near Nut, and a fifth at Abju. Further monuments in the series have been identified at Zawiat El Maiden, in Middle Egypt, Salah, at the entrance to the Fayum, and Hut Harib, modern Tel Atrib, in the Delta. Each of the locations was either a provincial capital or an important regional center. Abu was the capital of the first province of Upper Egypt, Giba, the capital of the second, and Nekhen the capital of the third, Hunis. Intention seems to have been to erect a visible marker of royal power in every province, and, to judge from the Abu Pyramid collection, centers for the royal treasury were also part of the plan. The monuments were not just symbols of the king's authority throughout the country, they were also practical instruments of that authority in the central management of the economy. For the local population, the small step pyramid in their midst would have served as a constant reminder of their economic duty to the state, a duty to pay their taxes to support the court in its projects. From the state's point of view, the monuments and their associated administrative buildings, with one facility in each province, made the collection of revenue both easier and more systematic. At the end of the Third Dynasty, the monarch and his administration had achieved their ultimate goal, absolute power. The stage was set for the greatest royal project the world had ever seen. Chapter 4. Heaven on Earth. Grand Designs. The pyramids at Giza are the sole surviving wonder of the ancient world. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon have disappeared without a trace. The Temple of Diana at Ephesus lies in ruins, but the pyramids stand as awesome and enduring today as when they were first built 4,500 years ago. Of the three pyramids built by successive generations of kings in the Fourth Dynasty, it is the oldest and biggest. The Great Pyramid of King Khufu, that attracts the most attention, and deservedly so. It is truly vast, built from 2.3 million blocks of stone, each weighing on average more than a ton, and covering an area of 13 acres. A simple calculation reveals that the builders would have had to set one block of stone in place every 2 minutes during a 10-hour day, working without a pause throughout the year for the 2 decades of Khufu's reign, 2545 to 2525. Once completed, at 481 feet high, the Great Pyramid remained unsurpassed in scale until modern times. For 44 centuries, until the completion of the Eiffel Tower in AD 1889. It was the tallest building in the world. Yet despite its massive size, it is engineered and aligned with breathtaking precision, its orientation to true north diverging by only 1/20th of 1 degree. More than any other monument in the world, the Great Pyramid seems to defy rational explanation. Little wonder that it has attracted wild speculation about its construction, meaning, and purpose. Theories range from the unorthodox, its blocks are made of an ancient type of concrete, to the downright dotty, the blocks were moved by sound waves, and a whole host of otherworldly builders have been invoked to account for its bewildering size and perfection, including refugees from Atlantis and visitors from another planet. The truth is, if anything, even more amazing. The Great Pyramid was, indeed, the product of something extraordinary, not extraterrestrial intelligence but a superhuman authority. This radical new projection of royal power had a profound significance for ancient Egyptian civilization as a whole, and to understand its origins, we need to go back a generation before the Great Pyramid, to the reign of Khufu's father. The Egyptians' penchant for monumentality can be traced back to prehistoric times at Nabta Playa. The construction of a vast edifice of stone was first fully realized during the reign of Khafre at the end of the Second Dynasty, and the first pyramid was built for his successor, Nacheriket, at the beginning of the Third. But the advent of the true, geometrical pyramid during the reign of Sneferu, 2575. 2545, first king of the 4th dynasty and father of Khufu, marked something quite new, not just the perfection of an architectural form or a change in the concept of the royal afterlife, but the transformation of the relationship between the king and his people, as was so often true. In ancient Egyptian history, the new order was initially proclaimed in the king's titles. For his Horus name, the most ancient and symbolically most significant element of the royal titulary, Sneferu took the phrase Nebmot. The common translation, Lord of Truth, scarcely does it justice. In ancient Egyptian ideology, Mot was the embodiment of truth, justice, righteousness, and created order, in short, the divinely ordained pattern of the universe. The word Neb meant not just Lord, but possessor, owner, and keeper. Sneferu was announcing nothing less than a new model of kingship. For him, the exercise of power was no longer confined to dispensing justice. It meant having a monopoly on truth. The king's word was the law because the king himself was the law. If this smacked more of divine than human authority, that was the point. To reinforce this blunt message, Sneferu adopted a new title, Necha. Nefer. It meant, simply, the perfect God. Is that really how his subjects saw him? Throughout history, megalomaniacs and tyrants have used such epithets, father of the nation, dear leader, but the terms usually have a hollow ring. Modern experience suggests that the titles are more about brainwashing and subjugation than the expression of popular acclaim. And yet, when it comes to ancient Egypt, scholars still balk at such an interpretation. A leading expert on the Pyramid Age has written that support for the system was genuine and widespread, and that coercive state mechanisms, such as police, were conspicuous by their absence. One unless 4th dynasty Egypt was a utopian society, never again experienced in human history. This rose-tinted view seems highly unlikely. When the head of state is the perfect God, opposition becomes not just unwise but unthinkable. When the king also controls the written record, it is hardly surprising that accounts of repression or brutality are absent. Archaeology, however, reveals something more of the truth. Throughout the first 3 dynasties, Egyptian society retained much of its prehistoric character. The material culture was largely dominated by forms of pottery, stone vessels, even statuary, derived from pre-dynastic antecedents. The major regional centers were still those from the period of state formation, places such as Inerti, Nekep, Chini, Nut, and Nekhen. Beyond the immediate confines of the royal court, society, too, seems to have been organized along ancient traditional lines, dominated by family, regional, and perhaps tribal loyalties. All that seems to have changed at the beginning of the 4th dynasty. New styles of pottery and sculpture were promulgated by the court to be produced in state workshops. New towns were founded by the state to replace the earlier centers of power. Ayunet, modern Dendera, displaced Chini as the regional administrative capital. Thebes grew at the expense of Nut, and Jiba eclipsed Nekhen. It is tempting to see these phenomena as parts of a deliberate and coordinated government policy designed to snuff out local autonomy and replace it with a new, absolute dependency on central authority. Even in the mortuary sphere, the king's commanding presence held sway. Anyone with any position whatsoever in the vast machinery of government now sought to be buried in the court cemetery, founded by the king and dominated by his own gigantic funerary monument, rather than being interred in their local burial ground, hallowed by age and ancestral ties. The first of these new court cemeteries grew up at Meidum, a rather remote site near the entrance to the Fayum. The choice of location was significant in itself. By breaking with tradition and eschewing the existing royal burial grounds of Abju and Saqqara, Sneferu was distancing himself from his ancestors, too. His was an avowedly forward-looking age, in which power would be independent of inheritance. As such, the age demanded a bold, new architectural statement. So Sneferu's engineers and builders set to work on a monument designed to surpass anything that had been attempted before. Although it followed the basic form of Necheriket's step pyramid, the maiden pyramid was altogether grander in scale, rising up in 8 giant steps, against Necheriket's 6, and was half again as high as its predecessor. In a further break with tradition, the complex of buildings surrounding the step pyramid was abandoned in favor of an elongated plan, with the various architectural elements laid out along an axis. This led eastward from the pyramid itself, via a small temple and a stone causeway to a valley temple on the edge of cultivation. The east-west orientation, replacing the northern alignment of 3rd Dynasty royal monuments, was no accident either. Sneferu's final journey would consciously mirror the sun's course across the heavens, from its rising in the east to its setting in the west. As the perfect god, the king was publicly associating himself with the supreme divinity and source of all life. But even this was not enough for a ruler of Sneferu's vaunting ambition. After about a decade on the throne, with the Maidum pyramid all but complete, the king embarked upon an even more audacious project. Once again, he chose a virgin site, modern Dashur, at the southern end of the great necropolis of Memphis. Perhaps deliberately, his chosen spot was within sight of Necheriket's step pyramid, but, as if to drum home the message that his was a new era, Sneferu had plans for an entirely new form of monument. Egypt's first true geometric pyramid. The subtle solar symbolism of the Maidum complex would be replaced by the overt representation of a shaft of sunlight, rendered in stone on a monumental scale. The name of the Dashur pyramid, appearance, used the same word as the rising of the sun. A new age had truly dawned. An 8.5-acre site was cleared for construction, and the plans were for the most majestic pyramid yet, with sides rising at a steep angle of 60 degrees to a height of nearly 500 feet. A subsidiary pyramid for the King's Ka, eternal spirit, a small side chapel, a long stone causeway, and a valley temple for the celebration of the royal mortuary cult were laid out at the same time, as part of a single grand design. To fund this massive project, and ensure a perpetual supply of commodities for the king's cult, an equally vast administrative effort was required. An entry on the Palermo stone for the 14th year of Sneferu's reign records the creation of 35 royal estates, complete with their human workforces, and 122 cattle farms. Many of new foundations were located in the wide expanses of the delta, and one of them, in the western delta, subsequently grew to a considerable size. Emu, modern Qam el-Hizn, demonstrates the extent to which government policy shaped the demography of Old Kingdom Egypt. Although cattle seem to have been reared in large numbers at the site, the local population did not enjoy the fruits of their labors. Their diet was unusually low in beef and cattle products, suggesting that most of the livestock was sent straight to the royal palace and cult centers near Memphis, leaving the cattle keepers themselves to survive on more meager fare. Even the cereals grown at Emu seem to have been fed preferentially to the cattle rather than to their human attendants. Once again, we see the essentially self-interested nature of the ancient Egyptian monarchy. This was not so much enlightened despotism as despotism, pure and simple, while the extensive low-lying fields of the delta provided ideal grazing for vast herds of cattle. The royal estates in Upper Egypt concentrated on grain production. The staple crop was barley, which provided the basic ingredient for both bread and beer. Egypt's climate and the annual regime of the Nile favored arable farming. As soon as the floodwaters receded, in early autumn, seed was broadcast over the newly irrigated and fertilized fields, and it germinated quickly. The main growing season coincided with the cooler months of winter, and this was followed by the onset of summer, which ripened the grain and allowed harvesting to take place in ideal conditions, before the inundation arrived to start the annual cycle over again. In such a favorable environment, it was relatively easy to produce a surplus. Easy, too, for the state to siphon off a significant percentage of agricultural production, by way of taxation, to fund its own projects. The end product of all this economic activity is illustrated in reliefs from the Dashur Valley Temple. In a frieze around the walls, a line of female offering bearers, each personifying a different royal estate, is shown, bringing supplies for the royal cult. The king was letting it be known that his pyramid was a national enterprise, involving the whole country. Whether the populace liked it or not, Pharaoh may have been able to command his people in their livelihoods, but he could not control the forces of nature. As his massive pyramid at Dashur reached the halfway point, geology rudely intervened. Cracks started appearing in the outer casing, the telltale signs of subsidence. The underlying sands and shales were simply not strong enough to support the vast weight of the growing pyramid, and the ground had begun to give way. As an emergency measure, extra blocks of stone were laid around the base of the pyramid, reducing the angle of the sides to 54 degrees, but it was too little, too late. Fissures started to open up in the internal corridors and chambers. The architects tried everything from plaster repairs to a new stone lining. They even used expensive imported logs to shore up the ceilings. An entry on the Palermo stone records the arrival of 40 ships from Kami, laden with coniferous timber, but to no avail. Finally, in a desperate attempt to salvage the pyramid, and their own careers from complete ruin, the architects implemented a radical change of plan. For the upper half of the pyramid, the angle of incline was reduced still further, to 43 degrees. Smaller blocks of stone were employed, and they were laid in horizontal courses, rather than the inward-sloping courses used previously, which had unintentionally contributed to the stresses and strains at the base. The result would be a completed pyramid, but a seriously botched job. Though it would ultimately reach 346 feet in height, the bent pyramid was hardly fit to serve as the eternal resting place of the perfect God. Exhausted and humiliated, Pharaoh's engineers, architects, and builders were left in no doubt about what they had to do: start again from scratch. Work continued on the bent pyramid, although now useless. It nevertheless had to be completed. An unfinished disaster would be the ultimate disgrace. Eventually the focus of attention and activity shifted toward preparations for a third great monument. This time, the lessons learned from bitter experience were rigorously applied. A site was chosen with stable underlying geology. The monument was planned from the outset, with a reduced angle of slope, the same 43 degrees, used for the upper part of the bent pyramid, and the stone blocks would all be laid in horizontal courses. Resources and manpower were mobilized as never before, for the only commodity in short supply was time. Pharaoh had already been king for 20 years, and his monument for eternity had to be finished before he died. As an insurance policy, the royal builders returned to Macedon to convert the king's 8-step pyramid into a true pyramid by casing it with additional masonry. For a time, major construction work was taking place on 3 different monuments simultaneously, an unprecedented commitment of manpower and resources. The accelerating pace of construction was extraordinary. In the first decade of Pharaoh's reign, during initial work at Macedon, his builders had laid around 46,000 cubic yards of stone per year. In the second decade, As the bent pyramid was taking shape, the rate was increased to 105,000 cubic yards per year. In the king's third decade on the throne, with work taking place on three fronts, between 130,000 and 200,000 cubic yards of stone were laid each year. It is unlikely that this work rate was ever surpassed, even a generation later during the construction of Khufu's Great Pyramid at Giza. Remarkably, it has been calculated that Sneferu's third pyramid, known today as the Red Pyramid, from the color of its core limestone blocks, could have been built in as few as 10.5 years. The extra effort involved in hauling blocks higher and higher up the pyramid was compensated for by the sharply reducing volume of the monument toward its apex. The first 11 courses of masonry, out of 157, accounted for 20% of the pyramid's total volume. By the time the builders laid the 66th course, less than halfway up, they had accomplished 80% of the work by volume. In such a way, with an unrelenting pace and enormous effort, the Red Pyramid was finished in good time. The greatest pyramid builder in Egyptian history finally had a monument worthy of the name. Indeed, the name appearance was transferred to the Red Pyramid, while the Bent Pyramid was rather embarrassingly renamed Southern Appearance. Not only was it perfect in outward form, but its interior chambers also showed a new sophistication of design, with elegantly corbelled roofs producing pyramid-shaped spaces to reflect the building as a whole. Two of the rooms stood at ground level, but the third, perhaps destined to be the king's burial chamber, was placed higher up in the body of the pyramid. In death as in life, the king would be elevated above the mundane, closer to heaven than to earth. The greatest show on earth. If the art of pyramid building was gradually perfected under Sneferu, it was taken to new heights by his son. Virtually nothing is known about Khufu. The man, and the events of his reign are sketchy, but it seems likely that he grew up in his father's shadow, his young life shaped by the court's obsession with pyramid building, and that he resolved to outdo even Sneferu by commissioning the ultimate in funerary monuments. The Great Pyramid at Giza marks the zenith not just of ancient Egyptian kingship but of the universal tendency for absolute power to project itself in grandiose architecture. At its most stark, the structure represents the untrammeled exercise of political and economic control. At its most inspirational, it represents a unique episode in human history. It is this combination of the sinister and the dazzling that gives Khufu's monument its enduring fascination. From the outset, it was designed to set new standards that would remain unsurpassed. Khufu chose the site carefully, the Giza Plateau, like Dashur, being visible from Saqqara, yet virgin ground. The underlying geology, a strong seam of limestone called the Mokatam Formation, was ideally suited to bear the weight of a gigantic monument. The local availability of building material in vast quantities was a further advantage, and during the inundation, boats could reach the base of the plateau, facilitating deliveries to the construction site from all over Egypt. The king also chose wisely when appointing the man who would oversee the entire project. For most of the Fourth Dynasty, the highest offices of state were reserved exclusively for senior male members of the royal family, in what seems to have been a deliberate policy to concentrate all power in the hands of the king. For the greatest undertaking of his reign, therefore, Khufu chose a trusted royal relative. Hemianu was probably the king's nephew. His membership in the king's inner circle undoubtedly gave him opportunities for advancement, but he must have possessed innate ability as well, for his rise to a position of great eminence was rapid. In his prime, he held a combination of courtly, religious, and administrative offices, ranging from elder of the palace to high priest of Thoth, the god of writing and wisdom. The unusual title Director of Music of the South and the North may reflect one of Hemianu's private interests, but the offices that conferred the greatest responsibility were those directly connected with the business of government, overseer of royal scribes, in other words, head of the civil service, and overseer of all construction projects of the king. Of all Khufu's construction projects, none was more important than his Great Pyramid, and Hemianu was responsible for the entire operation, from provisioning and organizing the workforce to quarrying and transporting the stone, from building and maintaining the construction ramps to marshalling the surveyors, architects, and supervisors. Hemianu's life-size statue from his tomb at Giza shows a man in full enjoyment of the benefits of high office, his pronounced corpulence emphasizing his wealth and privilege. Within aquiline nose and strong jaw, his facial features project an air of self-confidence and determination. Notwithstanding his impeccable royal connections, these were qualities he would have needed in large measure as he stood on the Giza plateau for the first time, at the beginning of his uncle's reign, contemplating the immense challenge that lay before him. The first, and in many ways the most crucial, stage of building a pyramid involved laying out and preparing the site. The extraordinary precision with which the Great Pyramid is aligned to the points of the compass indicates that a method of orientation involving the stars must have been used. Solar methods are simply not accurate enough. The precise technique that the Egyptians used is not certain, but it may well have involved a pair of stars that circle the celestial North Pole. When the two are in a direct vertical alignment, easily checked with a simple plumb line, the line of sight toward them marks true north. We may imagine this alignment ceremony being carried out with great solemnity, in the presence of priests, with Hemianu and perhaps the king himself looking on, for the efficacy of the pyramid as a means of resurrecting the king after his death depended on the accuracy of its orientation, as we shall see later. Once the site had been laid out, and the ground cleared and leveled, probably by using channels cut into the surface of the rock and filled with water, it was time for the construction itself to begin. The scale of the project seems almost overwhelming today, but to the government machine of Khufu's reign, with the benefit of a generation's experience and the construction of vast pyramids, it may have appeared less daunting. The ancient Egyptian approach to any large-scale undertaking was to divide it up into a series of more manageable units. When it came to pyramid building and the organization of a vast workforce, this proved both efficient and highly effective. The basic unit of the workforce was probably a team of 20 men, each with its own team leader. This kind of organization would have produced a team spirit, and a sense of friendly rivalry between teams would have encouraged each to try and outdo the others. This was certainly the case with larger units of the workforce, as surviving inscriptions testify. 10 teams formed a 200-strong division, known today by the Greek term phyle. 5 phyles, each with its own leader and identity, made up a gang of 1,000 workers. And 2 gangs, again with distinctive and often jokey names, such as the King's Drunkards, made a crew, the largest unit of men. The pyramid-shaped structure of the workforce reflected the monument itself. Like the regiments, battalions, and companies of an army, the organizational arrangement engendered a strong sense of corporate identity and pride at different levels of the system. Team vied with team, phyle with phyle, and gang with gang to be the best and to win recognition. This structure was a simple and ingenious solution to a massive task, and it ensured that motivation was maintained. It needed to be. Throughout the 2 decades it took to build the Great Pyramid, the construction work was hot, unrelenting, exhausting, and dangerous. The conditions must have been particularly unpleasant. Down in the main quarry, a few hundred yards south of the pyramid itself, choking clouds of limestone dust, the blinding glare of the quarry face, the constant din of chisels, swarms of flies, and the stench of sweated labor. It was not a pleasant environment. The rawest of Recruits had to serve their time here, earnestly hoping for promotion, and working hard to achieve it. Not that the alternative was any less strenuous. Hauling the vast stone blocks from Quarry Phase 2. Construction site was backbreaking work. Each block, weighing a ton or more, had to be levered onto a wooden sledge, then dragged by ropes along a carefully prepared track. At the end of its journey, it had to be taken off the sledge and moved carefully into position, ready for shaping and finishing. And all this at the pace of 1 block every 2 minutes, for 10 hours a day. Despite its superhuman scale, Khufu's monument was nevertheless a profoundly human achievement, and well within the capacity of the ancient Egyptians. Calculations and practical experiments have shown that just 2 crews, or 4,000 men, would have been sufficient to quarry, haul, and set in place the more than 2 million stone blocks used to build the pyramid. Perhaps the same size of workforce again would have been required to construct and maintain the vast ramps leading from the main quarry to the pyramid and up the sides of the monument as it grew steadily in height. Another army of workers toiled behind the scenes to keep the whole operation going. Carpenters to make the sledges for dragging huge blocks of stone, water carriers to lubricate the passage of the sledges along wood and mud tracks, potters to make the jars for the water carriers as well as the day-to-day ware for storage, cooking, and eating, smiths to forge and repair, copper chisels for the quarrymen, bakers, brewers, and cooks to supply the entire workforce. Even so, the number of people employed at any one time on the Great Pyramid project may not have risen much beyond 10,000. Only a relatively small contingent of specialist quarrymen, surveyors, engineers, and craftsmen, together with their wives and children, lived at the pyramid site year-round. The majority of the workers were temporary employees, serving for a period of a few months before returning to their families in towns and villages throughout Egypt. The pyramid town in which these ordinary workmen were quartered reveals fascinating details of their daily lives. During the construction of the Great Pyramid, the main settlement, called Jergit Khufu, settlement of Khufu, was located near the cultivation, close to Khufu's valley temple. Large quantities of broken pottery, charcoal, ash, and animal bones indicate a hive of activity, focused primarily on feeding the thousands of workers. Farther south, at the edge of the Giza Plateau, an even larger pyramid town flourished during subsequent reigns. The town illuminates the meticulous organization and planning that went into pyramid building. Separated from the sacred necropolis by a massive stone wall, 30 feet high and 30 feet thick at the base, the town was carefully laid out. Its various components all point to a rigidly hierarchical arrangement mirroring and reinforcing the management pyramid of the workforce. The men slept in fairly primitive conditions, on rough earth beds, ranged along the walls of barrack blocks. Each long, narrow unit could have housed 2 teams of 20 workers. At the back of each unit, more spacious living quarters were probably reserved for the team supervisors, the overseer in charge of the entire operation, not an individual of Heminu's rank but the official who supervised day-to-day activity at the construction site, lived in even greater comfort in a large, detached villa. Directly opposite, a columned hall could have served as a communal dining facility. Eating together would certainly have helped to reinforce bonds of community and friendship among the workforce. The hard manual labor of pyramid building demanded a diet rich in protein, and up to 11 cattle and 30 sheep and goats were slaughtered every day in the town, providing meat to supplement the abundant rations of dried fish. At the same time, dozens of bakeries were kept busy producing the ancient Egyptian staples of bread and beer. As the most important dietary ingredient, grain was carefully rationed and its distribution was kept under close supervision. The silos and granaries were situated within a royal administrative complex, set within its own double enclosure wall at the edge of the town for added security. Despite the friendly camaraderie among the workforce, there was no forgetting whom they served. Perhaps the most intriguing question surrounding Khufu's monumental construction project related to its purpose. What inspired such a feat of architecture, engineering, and sheer administrative effort? Why would 10,000 men toil for 20 years to build an artificial mountain of stone? The easy answer, favored by Egyptologists, cites the ideology of divine kingship, the notion that the monarch was the sole arbiter between the people and the gods, the defender of created order and the guarantor of Egypt's continued stability and prosperity. In such a system, the population would surely have labored willingly on a vast royal project in order to honor and maintain the covenant between them and their ruler. Perhaps, but even if pyramid building was a form of social security, providing employment for a large proportion of the population, especially during the months of the inundation when the fields were underwater, even if the workers were reasonably well housed and fed, not the slaves of popular myth. Even if the overseers impressed upon their recruits the noble nature of the task at hand, the fact remains that the conditions were uncomfortable, at best, and the work compulsory. When royal officials came to a village to draft its men for state service, there is unlikely to have been much rejoicing. Workers sustained frequent injuries on the Giza Plateau, their skeletons showing evidence of broken bones, severe lower back stress, and painful arthritic joints. Accidents must have been frequent, often resulting in fatalities. The official record is predictably silent about how many died building the Great Pyramid. So, if the pyramid was not exactly a national project in which the whole country could take part and feel pride, what was it? The uncomfortable answer is that it was the ultimate projection of absolute power. Despots throughout history have been attracted to colossal buildings, from Nicolae Ceausescu's Palace of the People in Bucharest to tin-pot dictator Felix Houphouët-Boigny's vast and ridiculous basilica in the jungles of Ivory Coast. The Great Pyramid of Khufu is merely the most audacious and enduring of such fully the grandeur. Little wonder that its royal builder gained a posthumous reputation as a megalomaniac tyrant with scant regard for human life. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 4th century BC, declared that Khufu brought the country into all sorts of misery. He closed all the temples, then, not content with excluding his subjects from the practice of their religion, compelled them without exception to labor as slaves for his own advantage. Herodotus added that the Egyptians can hardly bring themselves to mention him, so great is their hatred. To the symbolism of the Great Pyramid has not been lost on more recent dictators. After his invasion of Egypt in AD 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte made straight for Giza and camped his soldiers at the foot of the plateau, before rallying them with the words, "Soldiers of France, 40 centuries gaze down upon you." The Great Pyramid is not only the epitome of monumentality and indestructibility. What makes it unique are its unparalleled accuracy and complexity. Its precise orientation to true north has already been commented upon. Most extraordinary of all are the narrow shafts that lead upward and outward from the burial chamber, and the chamber below it, through the solid masonry, to the outer edge of the pyramid, stopping just short of the world beyond. Erroneously dubbed air shafts, they had a purpose that was altogether loftier and more transcendent. For they pointed to the stars, more specifically to the culminations of Sirius, the dog star, a star in the constellation Orion, and two of the circumpolar stars that rotate around the celestial North Pole. The ancient Egyptians were accomplished astronomers, and stars played an important part in state religion, especially in beliefs about the king's afterlife. The circumpolar stars were a particular source of fascination. They alone remained permanently visible in the night sky, never setting, and were thus the perfect metaphor for the king's eternal destiny, a place in the great cosmic order of the universe that would endure forever. Khufu's pyramid was nothing less than a way of uniting heaven and earth for the everlasting well-being of the king, son of the sun. The pyramids of Giza are an appropriate symbol of ancient Egyptian society in the 4th dynasty, 2575 to 2450, just as the tombs of courtiers and workmen clustered around the king's own funerary monument, or as close as the tomb's owner's status allowed, so the country at large showed a similar dependence on royal power. Members of the ruling class chose to have themselves depicted as lowly scribes, emphasizing their service to the king. Autobiographical inscriptions written on tomb walls further reinforce this culture of servitude. It is no coincidence that one of the longest-lasting of all ancient Egyptian funerary formulae first appeared in the early 4th dynasty, written in tomb chapels, on offering tables, and later on coffins. It expressed the notion that all provisions for the tomb and the owner's mortuary cult depended upon royal largesse, constituting an offering which the king gives. The elevation of the king found further expression in the appearance and growing popularity of personal names where the name of a god was replaced with the name of the reigning monarch. Children given names such as Khufu Kaf, Khufu, he appears, might well have grown up wondering if there was any practical difference between the king and the sun god. The conscious modeling of the royal mortuary temple on the shrines of the gods further blurred the distinction. This profound change in the relationship between the king and his subjects reflected an aggrandizement of monarchy that is seen not just at Giza, the epicenter of royal authority, but in the furthest reaches of the Egyptian realm. Inscriptions among the inhospitable mountains of Sinai, to the northeast, and on an isolated rocky outcrop in the southwestern desert bear witness to the state-sponsored expeditions sent by Khufu and his successors to the remotest corners of Egypt. The purpose of the expeditions was to bring back precious stones for the royal workshops, materials that could be transformed into statues, jewelry, and other costly objects to project and enhance the king's authority. The opulence, even decadence, of Khufu's court is most evident in 2 tombs excavated close to the Great Pyramid. One belonged to a dwarf called Pernanku, whose job was to entertain the king and members of the royal family, perhaps by dancing and singing. The ancient Egyptian equivalent of a medieval court jester. We may imagine the scenes of feasting and revelry that took place in the royal palace, while the king's subjects bedded down in their cramped barracks at the end of yet another day of toil on the Giza Plateau. The second tomb contained equipment prepared for the king's own mother, and it provides revealing insights into the lifestyle of 4th dynasty royalty. Hetepheres was the wife of one great pyramid builder, Sneferu, the mother of another, and very probably a king's daughter to boot. As befitted her exalted status, she lived a life of luxury and ease, borne from place to place in a gilded carrying chair with ebony panels. Its gold-inlaid hieroglyphs spelled out her many titles: Mother of the Dual King, Follower of Horus, Director of the Ruler, the Gracious One, whose every utterance is done for her. If these epithets are to be believed, it seems that Khufu took orders from only one person, and that was his mother. The impression of a peripatetic royal family, moving from one palace to another, is reinforced by the other items in Hetepheres' tomb equipment, which included a bed with a separate canopy and 2 low chairs. The furniture was lightweight and highly portable, easily dismantled and re-erected. Its simplicity and elegance of design, combining exemplary craftsmanship and sumptuous materials, encapsulates the self-confidence and restrained opulence of the 4th dynasty. Hetepheres' most treasured possessions were her jewelry boxes, one of which was specially designed to hold 20 silver bracelets. A figure of the queen on her carrying chair shows her wearing 14 of these bracelets at once, all along her right arm. At this period of Egyptian history, silver, which had to be imported from distant lands, was much more valuable than gold, and the bracelets were further enhanced by inlaid decoration in turquoise, lapis lazuli, and carnelian. All in all, Hetepheres must have presented a dazzling spectacle of an African queen, appropriate for the mother of an all-powerful king. But even Khufu could not defy mortality. Around 2525 he died, and was buried with proper pomp and solemnity in his Great Pyramid. The funeral ceremonies presided over by his son and heir, Pharaoh. The new king seems not to have inherited his father's penchant for lavish monuments. He built a much smaller pyramid in an entirely new site on the northernmost edge of the great Memphite necropolis. Perhaps he realized he could not compete at Giza. A more symbolic reason for the novel choice of location was that it faced the town of Ayunu, principal cult center of the sun god Ra. Pharaoh was clearly fascinated by the solar deity, and the sun's life-giving brilliance presented an eminently suitable metaphor for an omnipotent, resplendent monarchy. Pharaoh decided to harness this symbolism, to forge a bond between king and god that would achieve, in theological terms, what his father had achieved through monumental architecture. Pharaoh's very name, meaning Ra, he speaks, was a public statement of the sun god's supreme authority. The king went further, adding a new title to the royal collection by calling himself Son of Ra. It was a decisive break with earlier tradition, which had emphasized the primacy of the celestial falcon god Horus, and it underlined the Fourth Dynasty's independence from the past, their determination to establish a new model for kingship. Under royal patronage, the cult of Ra rapidly became the most powerful in the land, and the god himself rose to a position of unassailability in the Egyptian pantheon. The twin strands of Fourth Dynasty royal ideology, pyramid building, on a massive scale and a close association with the sun god, came together in the reign of Pharaoh's successor and younger brother, Khafra, beginning circa 2500. For his funerary monument he returned to Giza, siting his pyramid next to Khufu's, but he cleverly chose a slightly more elevated spot. This meant that, even though the pyramid was not quite as high as its neighbor, 474 feet as opposed to 482 feet, it appeared bigger, an inspired combination of deference and self-assertion. An impressive causeway led down the plateau to the Valley Temple, which was sheathed in polished slabs of red granite, a stone with strong solar connotations. Round the temple's inner hall, which was paved with dazzling white calcite, symbolic of purification, stood 23 life-size statues of Khafra. They showed the king, enthroned in majesty with the falcon god and traditional patron of kingship, Horus, perched behind his head, offering him protection. Each statue was carved from a single block of gneiss, a spectacular banded black and white stone brought hundreds of miles from a remote quarry in the western desert. The total effect, enhanced by carefully controlled light levels, must have been mesmerizing. Had there ever been a more imposing representation of kingship? But Khafra had not finished. His coup de grace was to order the transformation of an imposing knoll of rock that rose from the ground next to his valley temple. Under the mason's chisels, it was transmogrified into a giant recumbent lion, its human head bearing a royal countenance. The great sphinx symbolized nothing less than Khafra's unification with the sun god, guardian of the Giza necropolis. It reoriented the whole site around Khafra's own monument. Khufu's second son had not only trumped the Great Pyramid, he had effectively appropriated it as well. 3 generations of huge investment, human, material, and administrative, in pyramid building transformed Egypt but proved an unsustainable drain on its resources. Khafra's successor, Menkaure, was the last king to build a pyramid at Giza, and it was on a much reduced scale, reaching only 216 feet in height and only 1/10 of the volume of the Great Pyramid. The architects tried hard to compensate with an extravagant use of red granite, brought by barge, all the way from the First Cataract region, and by an enlarged pyramid temple, where Menkaura's funerary cult continued to be celebrated for centuries after his death. But the era of massive pyramids was over. Later kings would have to find new ways of projecting their power. An Arabic proverb states man fears time, but time fears the pyramids. The Great Pyramid was perhaps the most ambitious construction project of the ancient world. Its royal builder bestrode his era like a colossus. Yet, in one of the greatest ironies of archaeology, the only certain image of Khufu to have survived from his own time is a tiny thumb-sized statuette of ivory, discovered in the ruins of the temple at Abju. It measures just 3 inches high. The regalia of kingship are clear enough in the statuette. The king is shown enthroned, wearing the red crown and holding the royal flail, but the scale is diminutive. An autocrat during his lifetime and a tyrant in later tradition, history has finally cut Khufu down to size. Chapter 5. Eternity Assured. Them and us in one very crucial sense, the apparent stability of the Pyramid Age was an illusion. Behind the veil of glorious majesty, there were ripples of dissent within the royal family. In response to a series of dynastic crises at the height of the Fourth Dynasty, hushed up, but no less real. For that, the rulers of the later Old Kingdom took conscious steps to regain control of the succession. These steps, in turn, laid the foundations for a very different style of monarchy, in a different model of society, and the 3 centuries after the masons' chisels fell silent at Giza. Given that ancient Egyptian kings were invariably polygamous, it is not altogether surprising that sons born of different wives, and the wives themselves, should have jostled for influence and power. Factional quarrels are never explicitly mentioned in the written record. These quarrels hardly supported the picture of a serene and unchallengeable monarchy that the kings wished to present, but they can be guessed at from tantalizing clues, fleeting reigns in the midst of apparent dynastic stability, like Khafre's ephemeral successor, whose name is not even preserved, and sudden, unexplained departures in royal policy, such as the relocation of the royal burial ground from Giza to Saqqara at the end of the Fourth Dynasty. After the lackluster reign of Menkaura's successor, Shepseskh, notable only for his singular funerary monument that, in a radical departure from recent tradition, was shaped like a giant sarcophagus. Instead of a pyramid, a new dynasty, the fifth, 2450 to 2325, came to power in the person of King Userkaf. From the outset, he was eager to make a fresh start, presenting himself as the founder of a new age, a new model of government, and a new concept of kingship. The first and most public statement of his intent was his choice of tomb. Ignoring Shepseskh's bizarre innovation, he reverted to the traditional pyramid model. What's more significant, however, is that he chose to build it at the corner of Necheriket's Great Step Pyramid enclosure, by now venerable 200-year-old monument. He was thus explicitly associating himself with one of the great kings of the past. Just as the reign of Necheriket had marked a new beginning, so, too, would the reign of Userkaf. But whereas Necheriket's massive pyramid, and those of his Fourth Dynasty successors, had projected an uncompromising image of the king's political power, Userkaf chose a different path, emphasizing instead the sacred character of his office. While his pyramid was a rather small affair, at only 161 feet in height, it was the smallest royal pyramid to date. Far greater resources were devoted to a monument quite separate and distinct from the king's tomb. This was a sun temple, built at the site of Abusir, midway between Saqqara and Giza. It was an innovation as bold and epic-making, in its own way, as the step pyramid, comprising a walled stone enclosure with a Symbolic mount at its center, Userkaf's monument, called Necken Ra. Ra's stronghold was designed, above all, to underline the king's unique relationship with the sun god. Sacrifices were made in its open court, under the rays of the sun, and consecrated to Ra upon an altar in front of the mound. If contemporary hieroglyphic representations are to be believed, the mound may even have been topped with a wooden perch, for the convenience of the sun god in his falcon form, as befitted a monument dedicated to the preeminent deity. The Sun Temple was endowed with its own land and personnel, and was at least as important an institution as the royal pyramid. Indeed, supplies destined for the king's mortuary temple were often delivered via the Sun Temple, which acted as a sacred filter, giving the goods used in the celebration of the king's own called an extra, divine stamp of approval. The Sun Temples built by Userkaf and his 5th dynasty successors were a bold attempt to rebrand Egyptian kingship. No longer able to bear the economic burden of colossal pyramids, the monarchy had to find a new way of projecting itself and underlining its position at the apex of ancient Egyptian society. It did so by removing the king even further from the mortal sphere, linking him more closely than ever with the realm of the divine. In the first 3 dynasties, royal ideology had stressed the king's position as the earthly incarnation of the ancient sky god Horus. In the 4th dynasty, Jidafra had taken the step of calling himself son of Ra, adding the sun god to the web of royal associations. Building upon these developments, Userkaf gave concrete expression to his relationship with the solar deity, and he would be remembered in later folk tradition as the very offspring of Ra. Subtle theology in place of naked displays of power. Psychology had replaced tyranny as the favored tool of royal propaganda. The deliberate distancing of the king from his subjects took other forms, too, while the tombs of bureaucrats had clustered tightly around the 4th dynasty pyramids at Giza, proximity to the royal monument, reflecting rank at court. In the 5th dynasty a marked separation was enforced between the divine king and mere mortals. Royalty in the common people would be carefully demarcated in death as well as in life. A necropolis for high-ranking officials was established at Saqqara. Less prominent individuals had to make do with the tomb at Giza, now abandoned as the main center of royal activity, but the royal pyramid kept its distance, moving even farther away, to Abusir, under Userkaf's successors. Nor were the officials themselves as closely connected to the royal family as they had been in times past. From the dawn of Egyptian history until the late 4th dynasty, the highest offices of state had been reserved for the king's relatives. Without exception, every vizier from the reign of Sneferu to the reign of Menkaure had been a royal prince, and most of the overseers of works as well. In a dramatic and far-reaching departure, Userkaf opened up the top jobs in the administration to men of non-royal birth. The motives for such a radical shift of policy seemed to have been both ideological and pragmatic. It allowed the king and his family to rise above the nitty-gritty of government. Just as important, by removing political power from the hands of often quarrelsome princes, Userkaf no doubt hoped to avoid the internal wranglings that so often threaten the stability of the monarchy. The result was a new class of professional bureaucrats, men who achieved power as much by their own abilities as by their royal connections. At the same time, the administration expanded to reflect increased job specialization. Whereas it might have worked for a prince to hold a diverse portfolio of responsibilities, connected only by the fact of his royal blood, a full-time, professional administrator could scarcely be expected to excel at a dozen different roles simultaneously. From now on, career officials, not royal relatives, would be the backbone of the ancient Egyptian government machine. And without the aura or status of royalty, they would have much more to prove. An expanded professional bureaucracy composed largely of commoners, and the establishment of a new necropolis in which they could build their eternal resting places without reference to, and without being overshadowed by, the king's pyramid. These interlinked developments set the scene for the defining monuments of the later Old Kingdom, the tombs of the courtiers. For the first time in Egyptian history, they allow us to enter the world of the king's subjects, with often surprising results. Keeping up appearances. Above all, the private tombs of the 5th and 6th dynasties, 2450 to 2175, are extraordinary works of art. The sophistication of their painted reliefs testifies to the skills of ancient Egyptian craftsmen, skills that had been honed over many generations in the royal cemeteries of Dahshur and Giza, with space to build larger monuments and ambitious piers to impress. The high officials of the later Old Kingdom took the business of tomb construction and decoration very seriously. It swiftly became a competitive activity, and a bureaucrat would wait as long as he dared before commencing work on his monument, hoping for one final promotion that would enable him to lord it over his contemporaries and their descendants, in appropriately grand architectural fashion. Officials lavished particular attention on their tomb chapels, the public rooms or suites of rooms above ground where family members and other visitors would come after the owner's death to present offerings to his statue. By contrast, the burial chamber itself, below ground and out of sight, rarely received more than the most cursory decoration. If you've got it, flaunt it would certainly have struck a chord with the ancient Egyptians. As for the decoration, certain themes were de rigueur. Although an elaborate tomb was an essential piece of one-upmanship in the competitive world of the Old Kingdom civil service, its more fundamental purpose, to protect and nurture the undying spirit of the deceased for all eternity, could neither be forgotten nor neglected. So, the most important tomb scenes were those that depicted the manufacture and presentation of offerings, ranging from the basics of life, bread and beer, to the finer accoutrements of privilege, such as furniture, jewelry, and wine. Incidentally, such scenes provide a wealth of information about the techniques of agriculture, craft production, and food preparation, but recording daily life was not their primary purpose. Rather, they were an artistic insurance policy, according to Egyptian beliefs. If the actual grave goods buried with the body were ever exhausted or destroyed, the scenes would come to life in the tomb and ensure a continuous supply of every requirement by magical means. The lines of painted offering bearers, marching incessantly toward the false door that communicated with the burial chamber below, would similarly become animated by magic and never fail to deliver their bounty to the tomb owner. Given the twofold purpose of a tomb chapel, to proclaim the owner's status and guarantee him a comfortable afterlife, it is not surprising that the decoration presents a highly idealized view of life in ancient Egypt. The sculptors and painters were required to depict things not as they really were but as the client wished them to be. Decoration was designed, above all, to reinforce the established social order. For example, while the owner stands tall, dominating every scene, his servants, and, indeed, his wife and children, are more often shown as diminutive figures, sometimes barely reaching his knees. This principle of hierarchical scaling, so strange to modern eyes, perfectly reflects the Egyptians' obsession with rank. Another feature of tomb decoration is its deliberate timelessness. There is little or no sense of narrative progression. Scenes appear as if suspended in space and time. The key moments in the owner's life, such as his childhood, marriage, and promotion to high office, are conspicuous by their absence, for to have included them in the decoration would have perpetuated them for eternity. Only the end point, the peak of achievement, wealth, and status, was deemed appropriate to immortalize in art. Although tomb scenes may not be reliable evidence for the realities of daily life, they do allow us to enter into the fantasies of the ancient Egyptian elite. The pleasures of the idle-rich are meticulously recorded: hunting in the desert, fishing and fowling in the marshes, and a range of indoor pursuits. Muruka, a vizier of the early 6th dynasty, is shown painting and playing board games. In another scene, members of his household staff prepare his bed, ranging the mattress, headrest, and canopy. Muruka then relaxes on his four-poster while his wife entertains him by playing the harp. When, from time to time, he had to bestir himself and actually do some work, he could at least enjoy traveling from place to place in the comfort of a shaded palanquin, borne on the shoulders of servants. Such activities were, of course, a world away from the harsh realities of life in rural Egypt, ancient and modern. The bureaucrats of the later Old Kingdom may have been commoners, but once they had climbed the greasy pole of career advancement, they were more than content to shut themselves off from the rest of the population and wallow in pampered luxury, or at least the promise of it after death. Very occasionally, a glimpse of the world beyond the silken veil is allowed to intrude, but only to emphasize a point. In Muruka's tomb, his life of leisure is contrasted with the brutal punishment meted out to tax defaulters over whom he exercised authority. An unpleasant fate indeed awaited the head man of a village found in arrears. After being frog-marched to the local tax office, he could expect to be lashed naked to a whipping post and flogged with wooden sticks, while scribes stood by recording the offense and the punishment. Away from the cloistered lives of the hunting and fishing set, life was mean and miserable. Nowhere is this disparity better illustrated than in matters of health. The upper echelons of society were able to call upon the services of doctors, dentists, and other medical specialists. In their tombs, the elite are always depicted in vigorous good health, the men fit and virile, the women nubile and graceful. By contrast, skeletons and mummified remains, as well as the occasional tomb scene, confirm that the peasantry suffered from a range of debilitating and painful diseases, many of them still prevalent in Egypt today. Schistosomiasis, a parasitic disease transmitted by water snails in canals, ditches, and stagnant pools, caused blood in the urine, sometimes leading to anemia, and must have been a common cause of ill health and early death. Tuberculosis seems to have been prevalent, often leading to deformation of the spine. Pott's disease, and similar symptoms were no doubt a common result of unremittingly hard physical labor. Tumors, too, are attested on Old Kingdom skeletons, while 3 depictions in contemporary tombs may represent individuals suffering from hernias. Apart from adding a little color to scenes of peasants at work, disease, deformity, dirt, and descent had no place in the aristocratic ideal of the ruling elite. The impression of a governing class badly out of touch with the rest of the population is only reinforced when we look at the jobs of these tomb owners. To be sure, some of them, such as Muruka and his predecessor Kagame, were viziers and held important government offices. But others seem to have had little or no administrative responsibility, instead deriving their exalted status purely from their proximity to the king. Urukapta, the head of palace butchers, undoubtedly had a central part to play in the provisioning of the royal court, but the splendor of his tomb at Saqqara, complete with scenes of butchery, suggests that the king cared rather more about what he ate for dinner than about how his ministries were run. In a similar vein, the twin brothers Nikanam and Kamhotep, joint heads of palace manicurists, were rewarded for their devoted attention to the royal fingernails with a beautifully decorated tomb. The vizier Kentuka owed his promotion not to his experience of sound administration but to his varied roles in the king's personal service, which included controller of the robing room, overseer of clothes, administrator of every kilt, chief of secrets of the bathroom, and even overseer of the king's breakfast. At an effete royal court steeped in pampered privilege, the most sumptuous of all 5th dynasty tombs at Saqqara was built not for a chancellor or overseer of works but for the head of palace hairdressers. Tai's magnificent edifice comprises a vast open courtyard with pillars forming a shady portico on all 4 sides, a long corridor leading to a further 2 rooms, and a separate chamber to house his statue. He demonstrates the extent to which royal favor was still the main passport to wealth and status. The administration had indeed been opened up to commoners, but old habits died hard. This age-old method of advancement is exemplified in the career of Hatshepsut, circa 2400, owner of the largest known 5th dynasty private tomb in all Egypt. The major turning point in his career was his second marriage, when he took the hand of the king's own daughter. Becoming a royal son-in-law gained Hatshepsut access to the innermost circle at court. His newfound status prompted a major enlargement of his funerary monument, including the addition of a grand columned entrance. But such dizzying success came at a price. He seems to have been forced to disinherit his eldest son, born of an earlier marriage, in favor of the children from his second, royal marriage. Loyalty to the monarch counted for more than loyalty to one's own family. The reforms of the early 5th dynasty, which had been designed to distance the royal family from the business of government, unintentionally resulted in an overstaffed, overpaid, and overbearing bureaucracy. By the middle of the dynasty, government jobs, and the highfalutin titles that went with them, had multiplied to such an extent that a special system of ranking titles was introduced, to help distinguish between different degrees of privilege. But the growing influence of high officials had begun to threaten the king's monopoly on power and could not be allowed to continue unchecked. Toward the end of the dynasty, circa 2350, the monarchy implemented a major reorganization of the administration, to reduce the number of bureaucrats and curb their powers. A central plank of these reforms was the delegation of responsibilities to officials based in the provinces. While the intention was to restrict the influence of the ambitious men at court, the unintended consequence was a weakening of central government itself, with far-reaching and long-lasting repercussions for the stability of the Egyptian state. Officialdom, once given a taste of power, would not be easily muted. The bureaucrats whose careers defined the later Old Kingdom would, in the end, be responsible for its demise. Temples and texts. While the ruling class was leaving its mark on a series of lavishly decorated tombs, the kings of the 5th dynasty, 2450 to 2325, concerned themselves with their own architectural legacy, pyramids and sun temples. Userkaf's 5 successors paid homage to the sun god Ra in their names, Dahira, Neferkara, Shepseskara, Neferfra, and Niusra, and erected their pyramids at Abusir, in the vicinity of Userkaf's sun temple. While nowhere near as large or as solidly built as 4th dynasty pyramids, these 5th dynasty counterparts were beautifully and extensively decorated in keeping with the fashion of the time. Saqqara's pyramid complex alone contained an estimated 12,000 square yards of relief carving. The decoration included several new genres, such as scenes of gods presenting foreign captives to the king, or a goddess suckling the monarch. The sophisticated taste of the court is also evident in the deliberate and careful use of contrasting types of stone. Saqqara's Valley Temple had a dado and columns of red granite, the latter shaped like palm fronds, a floor of black basalt, and upper walls of fine white limestone, while the roof was painted dark blue with golden stars, to resemble the night sky. The covered causeway leading up the escarpment was decorated with reliefs along its whole length, and further decoration covered the walls of the mortuary temple next to the pyramid proper. The whole effect must have been spellbinding. The mortuary temple was not merely the inner sanctum of the whole complex, it also housed the king's statue, which was the focus of cult activity during his reign and, he hoped, for eternity. Needless to say, every monarch was to be frustrated in this hope, and few cults were maintained for more than a few generations after their founders' deaths. Remarkably, archives of papyrus documents have survived from 2 mortuary temples at Abusir, the temples attached to the pyramids of Neferkara and Neferfra, and they give unrivaled information about the day-to-day operation of a royal funerary cult in the Old Kingdom. They reveal a system obsessed with bookkeeping, but a mindset that was more concerned with processes and protocols than standards. The personnel of Neferkara's temple served on a monthly rota, and at the beginning of each 30-day period the members of staff coming on duty were required to carry out a thorough inspection of the temple and its contents. The building itself was examined for damage, and each piece of furniture or equipment was checked against a detailed inventory, ranged systematically by material, shape, and size. One sheet of papyrus lists items made from stone and flint. Under the heading crystalline stone, subheading bowls, category white, an inspector has noted various repairs to rim and base, and to sides. A blade of flint is recorded as having chips missing, having been dropped, while a small silver offering table was found in an equally parlous state, badly split, loose joints, corroded. The fact that these inspections took place just 50 years after Nefertiti's death shows how quickly items of temple equipment could become damaged. Apparently, regular inspection and recording was more important than actually looking after the items in question. Style over substance, impression over action, an all too common phenomenon in societies hamstrung by bureaucracy. Deliveries of foodstuffs and other supplies were also meticulously recorded, but here again there were systemic failures that even the most assiduous record-keeping could not mask. Among the commodities due each day at Nefertiti's Sun Temple were 14 consignments of special bread. During 1 year, none arrived on the first day of the month, none on the second, and none on the third or fourth, until on the 5th day of the month 70 batches were delivered in one go. The next 6 days' supplies failed to materialize at all and seemed to have been written off. By contrast, the next 11 days, deliveries were received on time. Apparently even a society as structured and prescribed as ancient Egypt could not ensure the regular delivery of the most basic commodities being transported from one royal foundation to another. It is a surprising revelation, at odds with the outward impression of a well-ordered, confident, and efficient civilization. Perhaps the Old Kingdom governmental machine was not as robust as its monuments like to suggest, even in times of peace and plenty, let alone in the face of serious political or economic turbulence. Those who dared to look beyond their own rhetoric might have seen that the seeds of collapse had not only been sown, they were already germinating. Not that Yunus, the last king of the 5th dynasty, 2350 to 2325, was outwardly concerned with such problems. He was far too busy reinventing traditions, adding new and innovative elements to the already weighty edifice of royal ideology. Like Userkaf before him, he chose a site for his pyramid at one corner of Necheriket's steppe pyramid enclosure. And it was not only the pyramid's location that announced Yunus as a Renaissance ruler. The most radical innovation was reserved for the chambers underneath the monument, eschewing the stark simplicity of earlier undecorated walls. Yunus commissioned an altogether more elaborate resting place for his afterlife. His coffin was painted black to symbolize the earth, while the ceiling of the burial chamber was studded with golden stars against a dark blue background to mimic the night sky. Round the sarcophagus, the walls of the burial chamber were lined with white alabaster, grooved and painted to resemble an enclosure made from a wooden frame and reed matting, representing the type of primitive shrine that the ancient Egyptians believed had existed at the dawn of creation. The whole ensemble was designed to be nothing less than a microcosm of the universe. The greatest novelty of all was the decoration on the walls of the burial chamber and anteroom, column after column of text, painted blue to recall the watery abyss of the underworld. The so-called pyramid texts constitute the earliest surviving body of religious literature from ancient Egypt, and the only large corpus of inscriptions from the Old Kingdom. They are a motley collection of prayers, spells, and hymns, all designed to assist the king in his afterlife journey into the cosmic realm to join the indestructible circumpolar stars. The language and imagery of some utterances suggest that they date back many centuries, perhaps even to the dawn of Egyptian history. Others were surely composed anew at the end of the 5th dynasty. Spells, incantations, and prayers must have played a part at all royal funerals and in all royal mortuary cults. Yet the idea of inscribing them permanently on the walls of the king's tomb, to serve for eternity, was an innovation of Yunus's reign. They were not simply carved, willy-nilly, on any available surface. Rather, the careful disposition of text on different walls was designed to reinforce the symbolic geography of the pyramid itself. Texts explicitly concerned with the underworld were concentrated in the burial chamber, while the antechamber was identified as the horizon, the place of rebirth where the king might rise into the heavens. In this way, hieroglyphs and architecture complemented and strengthened each other, enhancing the magical power that was designed to guarantee Eunice's resurrection. But there was more to it than mere magic. The king could look forward to a glorious rebirth because he commanded absolute obedience from deities as well as mere mortals. As far as the king's relationship with the gods was concerned, he had might, as well as right, on his side. This rather shocking presumption is given voice in one of the most chilling of Eunice's pyramid texts, dubbed the Cannibal Hymn. Its graphic imagery has made it infamous. A brief extract gives the flavor. The king's theologians and hymnographers had excelled themselves in conveying the starkest of messages. Eunice was omnipotent because he had literally consumed and assimilated the powers of the divine realm in all their manifestations. Nothing and no one could stand in his way of achieving cosmic immortality. Such a tyrannical attitude toward the gods did not bode well for the king's relationship with his mortal subjects. The reign of Eunice has left little in the way of evidence for historic events. A battle scene showing Egyptians fighting Asiatics is a rare exception, but one particular series of scenes from his pyramid causeway suggests a grim episode with dreadful human consequences. The images of famine, rendered in excruciating detail, are horribly familiar to modern audiences, who are accustomed to scenes of misery and degradation emanating from the African continent. On the Eunice Causeway, the tableau is just as harrowing. A man on the verge of death is supported by his emaciated wife, while a male friend grips his arm. A woman desperate for food eats the lice from her own head. A little boy with the distended belly of starvation begs a woman for food. The mental and physical anguish is real enough, yet there are no inscriptions to identify the starving people. It is scarcely conceivable that they were supposed to be native Egyptians, since the whole purpose of art in a funerary context, especially in the king's pyramid complex, was to immortalize an ideal state of affairs. The only logical conclusion is that the famine victims are desert tribespeople, the descendants of Egypt's prehistoric cattle herders, who continued to eke out a precarious existence in the arid regions to the east and west of the fertile Nile Valley. Their parlous state was illustrated to contrast with the good fortune of the Egyptians. The miserable wretchedness of those living beyond Eunice's rule served both as a stark reminder and as a warning to his own subjects. For all the outward piety of the 5th dynasty kings, an older model of despotic monarchy had never entirely gone away. Cracks in the edifice. All the propaganda of art and architecture, of text and image, might buy the king immortality, but it could not bring him an heir. Mocking Eunice's self-promotion as the founder of a new age, fate decreed that he should die without a son to inherit his kingdom. The throne passed instead to a commoner, a man called Teddy, who swiftly married his predecessor's daughter to secure his legitimacy. So began the 6th dynasty, 2325 to 2175, in an atmosphere of uncertainty, court intrigue, and barely managed crisis that was to haunt it until the very end. With his rather tenuous claim to the kingship, Teddy needed to surround himself with trusted lieutenants. Their magnificent, decorated tombs at Saqqara, nestling close up against the royal pyramid, testify once again to the critical importance of royal patronage for career advancement, but also to the claustrophobic oligarchy of Teddy's court. The vizier Khagamai exercised unrivaled authority as the king's right-hand man. His successor, Mururuka, enjoyed great wealth and status, and luxuries unimaginable to the majority of the population. He could indulge his palate with haute cuisine of the most exotic kind. The scenes of animal husbandry in his tomb go beyond the normal depictions of cattle rearing to include semi-domesticated antelopes eating from mangers, cranes being force-fed. It seems foie gras was on the menu in 6th dynasty Egypt, and, most bizarre of all, hyenas being fattened for the table. Such refined pleasures were the reward for ultra-loyal service to the king, and were designed to ensure that Teddy's closest advisors were also his strongest supporters. Yet the greatest danger to his crown, and indeed his life, came not from his chief ministers but from disgruntled royal relatives, especially the male offspring of minor wives. For them, an attempted coup, however risky, was the only alternative to a life of idle frustration. If the historian Manetho is to be believed, Teddy suffered just such a fate, succumbing to assassination in a palace plot. The contemporary evidence, too, points to a hiatus in the succession, with an ephemeral king, usurper, ruling for the briefest of periods after Teddy's demise and not deemed worthy of mention in biographies of the time. Little wonder, perhaps, that when Teddy's chosen heir, Pepi I, finally achieved his birthright and was enthroned as king, he pursued a policy of extreme caution. He placed an unusual degree of trust in a very few high officials, notably his own mother-in-law, whom he appointed vizier for Upper Egypt, and brother-in-law, Zhao. Pepi pursued a vigorous policy designed to reassert royal prestige by commissioning cult chapels dedicated to himself at important sites throughout the land, from Bast, in the central delta, to Abju and Gebtu, modern Kift, in Upper Egypt. By contrast, temples dedicated to local gods were still virtually unknown in a country where public works focus entirely on kingship. But while such bold architectural statements of the king's power might have convinced the populace, the statements were less effective at stifling dissent among his entourage. Our best insight into palace politics during Pepi's 40-year reign, 2315 to 2275, comes from the tomb autobiography of a career courtier named Wani. He rose from the humble position of storehouse custodian to a financial position in the palace administration. Proximity to the king duly brought opportunities for advancement, and when he was promoted to overseer of the robing room and head of the palace bodyguard, becoming a key confidant of the monarch. As a measure of the trust placed in him by his sovereign, when he was given responsibility for sensitive judicial matters, I heard a case alone with the vizier, in complete confidence. I acted, in the name of the king for the royal harem. To the royal harem, comprising the households of the king's female relatives and minor wives, was an important institution in its own right. It owned land and operated workshops, notably for textile manufacture, and was thus a potential power base for an ambitious rival to the reigning king. Throughout ancient Egyptian history, palace intrigue and attempted coups would often originate inside the harem. It was therefore vitally important for the king to have someone on the inside he trusted implicitly, someone who could provide surveillance and report back to his royal master. And when he the king had chosen well, thanks to his diligence, a plot against Pepi I was discovered before it could achieve its seditious aims. To keep the lid on such a dangerous act of treason, the matter had to be investigated and the perpetrators brought to justice quickly and quietly. Wani duly obliged. Wani's rewards were commensurate with his loyal service. Promotion to the rank of sole companion in a stone sarcophagus, a token of status usually reserved for members of the royal family. The great monolith was transported in a great barge of the residence, together with its lid, a false door, an offering table, 2 gems, and a libation table forward by a company of sailors under the command of a royal seal bearer. This show of royal favor must have been a signal honor. Being responsible for the king's safety had its compensations. But in the uncertain world of the 6th dynasty, the dangers to an Egyptian ruler came not only from his own palace. Beyond the borders of Egypt, too, less fortunate peoples, those very nomads some mercilessly caricatured in Eunice's reliefs, were starting to view the Nile Valley's wealth with increasingly greedy eyes. These sand dwellers, as the Egyptians disparagingly called them, now rebelled against centuries of domination, provoking an immediate and savage Response. When he was put in charge of the operation to suppress the insurgency, swapping the gilded opulence of the royal robing room for the dusty field of battle, he led an army of Egyptian conscripts and Nubian mercenaries through the delta to engage the rebels in their desert homeland of southern Palestine, using a classic pincer movement, when he ordered half of the army to proceed by boat, landing in the enemy's rear, while the other half marched overland to launch a frontal attack. This strategy carried the day for the Egyptians, but the nomads were no pushovers. When he boasted, rather shallowly, that his Majesty sent me to lead this army on 5 occasions, to crush the land of the sand dwellers every time they rebelled. Eclipse. The use of mercenaries from Nubia to bolster a conscript army showed a renewed interest by Egypt's rulers in the lands to the south of the First Cataract. And for once Egyptian concern was not merely directed at exploiting Nubia's human and mineral resources. Along the upper reaches of the Nile, new powers were beginning to stir, powers that, if left unchecked, might disrupt the trade routes with sub-Saharan Africa and threaten Egypt's economic interests. The Egyptian government responded to the growing risk with a raft of policy initiatives. A fortified outpost of the central administration was established in the distant Dakhla Oasis, a key point along the desert route between Egypt and Nubia. The town of Ain Assia was provided with strong defensive walls and garrisoned with soldiers under the oasis commander. As part of the same military infrastructure, all major access routes into and out of the oasis were guarded by a network of watch posts, situated on hills, within signaling distance of one another, and supplied directly from the Nile Valley. The guard stations allowed Egyptian security personnel to keep an eye on all movements of people and goods entering or leaving the area. By such means, Egypt could both safeguard its crucial trade routes and help to prevent infiltration by hostile Nubians. Under Pepi I's successor, Merenra, when he was appointed governor of Upper Egypt, the first commoner to hold this strategically important post, when he gave the king eyes and ears in the far south of the country, the better to monitor developments across the border in Nubia. Merenra even made a personal visit to Egypt's southern border to receive a delegation of Nubian chiefs. By this unprecedented gesture, he hoped, no doubt, to secure their continuing loyalty to Egyptian overlordship or, failing that, at least a promise to refrain from outright hostility. However, a one-off royal visit in second or third hand reports from a local official were scarcely a good enough basis for deciding matters of national security. What was needed was first-hand intelligence from Nubia itself. This would form the third plank of the government's new policy toward its restive southern neighbor. The frontier town of Abu was Egypt's gateway to Nubia. Its inhabitants knew the Upper Nile better than any of their compatriots, and many had close economic or family links with the Nubian population just over the border. Government-sanctioned expeditions into Nubia had been taking place sporadically since the reign of Teti. At the beginning of the 6th dynasty, the time had come to place these reconnaissance missions on a more systematic footing, and of all the people in Abu, none was better qualified to undertake such a mission than the chief of scouts. He, after all, was the government official responsible for maintaining security and for ensuring that the peoples of Nubia and beyond delivered a steady supply of exotic products to the royal treasury. On Merenra's orders, the chief of scouts, a man named Harkuf, set out with his father, Iri, on an epic journey. His ultimate destination was the distant land of Yam, far up the Nile, beyond the limits of Egyptian control. The 1,000-mile return trip took 7 months, at the end of which Harkuf and Iri returned safely to Egypt, laden with exotic goods for their sovereign. Just as valuable must have been the intelligence they brought with them about political developments in Nubia. So troubling were the reports that Harkuf was sent to Yam a second time, abandoning the Pretense of a trade expedition. The intrepid traveler acknowledged the true purpose of his 8-month mission. I returned through the region of the realm of the ruler of Satu and Urjet, having opened up those foreign lands. 6. What Harkuf reported back to his master was an alarming development in the political geography of Lower Nubia. The local population, for so long subservient to the Egyptians, was showing signs of wishing to reassert its autonomy. The coalescence of districts, such as Satu and Urjet, was a dangerous warning sign that Egypt could not afford to ignore. Taking account of these new political realities on his third expedition to Yam, Harkuf studiously avoided the river valley, following instead the Oasis Road. On arrival at Yam, Harkuf discovered to his dismay that its ruler had left to fight his own battle against the Chame people of southeastern Libya. Old political certainties were crumbling, and across northeast Africa, lands were in a state of flux. Undeterred, Harkuf set out immediately in pursuit of the Yamite chief, following him to Chame land. The rendezvous accomplished, the two men concluded their negotiations to mutual satisfaction. Harkuf embarked on the journey home with 300 donkeys, laden with incense, ebony, precious oil, grain, panther skins, elephant tusks, thrill sticks, all good tribute. 7. However, the situation in Lower Nubia was now more hazardous than ever for an Egyptian envoy. Harkuf swiftly discovered that the chief of Satu and Urjet had added the whole of Wawa, Lower Nubia north of the Second Cataract, to his growing territory. Such a powerful chief was not about to allow Harkuf and his considerable booty to pass unhindered. Only the presence of an armed escort provided by the Yamites allowed Harkuf to continue his journey unmolested. Suddenly, Egypt was no longer the only serious power in the Nile Valley. Under its very nose, upstart Nubian chiefs had taken control, threatening Egypt's centuries-old domination. It was a dramatic reversal of fortune for the most prosperous and stable nation of the ancient world. Only decisive leadership might hope to restore Egyptian hegemony. Yet soon after Harkuf's return, Merenra died, leaving the throne to a boy of 6. The infant king, Neferkar Pepi II, was not in a position to offer any kind of guidance to his beleaguered country. At home, government was exercised by a regency council, headed by the king's mother and uncle. As for foreign affairs, the inexperienced advisors seemed to have decided to maintain a semblance of continuity by sending Harkuf on his fourth, and final, journey to Yemen. But gone, it seems, was the intelligence-gathering motive of earlier missions. Instead, this was to be an old-fashioned trade expedition, its objective to bring back exotic tribute for the new sovereign. This act of homage would serve publicly to proclaim Egypt's continued authority over neighboring lands, even as that authority ebbed away. It was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of fiddling while Rome burned. Harkuf abided loyally by his new orders and found just the trophy to delight his 6-year-old monarch, a pygmy of the gods' dances from the land of the horizon dwellers. 8. News of this dancing pygmy from the ends of the earth reached the boy king back in Egypt. Pepi II hurriedly penned an excited letter to Harkuf, urging him to hurry back to the royal residence with his precious human bauble. Receiving personal correspondence from the king, albeit a boy of 6, was the ultimate accolade for an Egyptian official. Harkuf had the complete text of the royal letter inscribed on the facade of his tomb, in pride of place next to the account of his 4 epic expeditions. It was to stand as an eternal testament to his sovereign's favor. Pepi II's boyish exuberance may have touched the heart of an old retainer, but it was hardly an effective remedy for a country beset by problems, internal and external. In Nubia, the coalition of states first reported by Harkuf in the reign of Merenra grew increasingly powerful and increasingly troublesome to Egyptian interests. One of Pepi's senior officials, the Chancellor Mehu, was killed by hostile locals while on an expedition to Nubia, and his body had to be retrieved by his son. In the course of a difficult mission, although the Egyptian presence remained strong in the Dakhla oasis, Egypt had effectively lost control of events in Nubia. At home, too, authority was slipping from the government's grasp. The devolution of political power to provincial officials, instigated in the late 5th dynasty, had proved both unwise and unstoppable. Local bigwigs, some now calling themselves great overlord of their province, were amassing ever more authority, arrogating to themselves a combination of civil and religious offices. When a mere local magistrate like Papiank of Mayor could revel in a list of dignities that covered an entire wall of his tomb, member of the elite, high official, counselor, keeper of Nekhen, head man of Nekeb, chief justice and vizier, chief scribe of the royal tablet, royal seal-bearer, attendant of the apis, spokesman of every resident of P, overseer of the 2 granaries, overseer of the 2 purification rooms, overseer of the storehouse, senior administrator, scribe of the royal tablet of the court, God's seal-bearer, sole companion, lector priest, overseer of Upper Egypt in the Middle Nomes, royal chamberlain, staff of commoners, pillar of Kenmut, priest of Mut, privy to the secret of every royal command, and favorite of the king in every place of his. Then, clearly, the system was out of control. Officials were now so busy feathering their own nests and ensuring their own eternal existence that they neglected the future well-being of the Egyptian state. In matters of traditional royal patronage, too, the central government seems to have lost its way. Outwardly, Pepi II's pyramid was the model of a 6th dynasty royal monument, complete with pyramid texts. But much of the decoration of the pyramid temple was slavishly copied from Sahira's complex at Abusir, with artistic creativity stalled. Looking back to an earlier golden age was an easy refuge for an administration that had lost its way. To compound the difficulties caused by a weak administration, headed by an ineffectual king, a prolonged period of low Nile floods wreaked havoc with Egypt's agricultural economy. So marked was the drought that the level of Birkit Karun dropped alarmingly, forcing the abandonment of the nearby basalt quarries that had supplied the state's building projects throughout the Old Kingdom. The lake shore was now simply too far from the quarry site to make the transportation of huge granite blocks practicable. The inadequate inundations caused widespread crop failure and economic stress on a national scale. In happier times, an effective government could have taken action to alleviate hardship, releasing stocks of grain from the state granaries to feed its hungry population. But Pepi II's regime seems to have been unable to respond adequately, crippled by inaction. In later periods, Pepi II would be remembered in scurrilous stories as a weak, ineffectual, effeminate ruler, sidetracked from the business of government by a clandestine affair with his army general. In truth, much of the problem did indeed lie with the king, not his sexual preferences but his sheer longevity. Usually, a long reign was the sign of a stable dynasty. But Pepi II's 6 or more decades on the throne, 2260 to 2175, caused major problems for the succession. Not only did the king see 10 viziers come and go, but he outlived so many of his heirs that the royal family struggled to find a single candidate who could command widespread support. Egypt was set on an unstoppable course toward political fragmentation. The young monarch, full of boyish exuberance, had become a frail old man, in theory immortal, and he must increasingly have seemed so to his subjects. In practice he had gone on too long. His passing, when it finally came, marked both the end of a life and the end of an era. The Old Kingdom had run its course.